In the summer of 1984, Camille and Grant were young, in love, and just married. They boarded a ferry to a secluded island retreat, a honeymoon haven tucked far away from the world. 3 days later, they vanished. No bodies, no boat, no trace. Authorities blamed the ocean. Families blamed each other. The island? It went quiet. But in 2009, 25 years later, a devastating storm crashes through that same island. And as the tide recedes, a boy scavenging the shoreline stumbles across something odd. An old rusted camera, half buried in seaweed. When the film is developed, it reveals something no one expected. The final hours of the missing couple. And possibly, the secret someone wanted buried forever. The rain came down in waves, not gentle or forgiving, but angry. The kind of storm that churns up everything, even the secrets the sea thought it had claimed for good. Isleta del Mar hadn't seen a storm like this in decades. Palm trees cracked in half. Boats snapped free from their moorings. The dock where honeymooners once waved to the horizon was now just scattered wood and sea foam. By morning, the sun emerged, not golden, but pale and exhausted. The island's silence returned, interrupted only by the crunch of wet sand beneath a boy's feet. 12-year-old Mateo was barefoot, dragging a stick behind him, searching for anything cool the storm might have coughed up. Broken shells, old lighters, a piece of driftwood shaped like a fish. Then he saw it, half buried in a clump of seaweed. Metal, crusted over in salt. He kicked at it. It didn't move. He crouched down. A camera. Heavy. Rusted. Vintage. The kind his grandfather once showed him, from back when people still wound film by hand. The lens was cracked. The body pitted with age and brine. But something was still inside. Mateo shook it. There was weight, not just water. Film. Still loaded. He didn't know it yet, but that discovery would undo 25 years of silence. Mateo didn't go straight home. He ran, camera clenched in his hand, salt and sand flying from his heels, to the edge of the village, to the old pink house with the blue shutters. That's where Don Javier lived, alone now, with his half-blind cat and walls lined with faded photo frames. Once, he was the island's only photo developer. Now, he mostly sat in his rocking chair, watching the waves for ghosts. Mateo burst in without knocking. "Abuelo, look what I found." Javier blinked slowly, then leaned forward, squinting at the object in Mateo's hands. "Santa Maria," he muttered. "I haven't seen one of these since—" His voice trailed off. He took the camera delicately, like it might break or bite him. His fingers, still steady despite age, twisted open the back hatch. And there it was, a roll of 35mm film, corroded but intact, sealed in salt, forgotten by time. "Could be ruined," he said. "Could be magic," Mateo replied. They developed it in the darkroom Javier hadn't touched in years. The chemical trays hissed and fumed. Shadows danced on the red-lit walls. One frame at a time emerged like ghosts. The first image, a couple standing on a wooden pier. She wore a white sundress, laughing mid-spin. He had one hand shielding his eyes, the other around her waist. A dock extended behind them, long, thin, empty, and disappeared into the sea. Javier froze. That pier, it's gone. Washed out in the 90s frame by frame, the couple came alive, posing near palm trees, sharing coconut water, sitting at the edge of a cliff with their backs turned to the camera. But one image made Javier inhale sharply. In the background behind the couple, blurred and distant, stood a third figure. Still. Watching. Not smiling. Lee Morgan hadn't opened that box in years. It sat on the top shelf of her hallway closet, taped shut, marked only with a name, Camille, her sister, her best friend, her shadow, and her son. She had only meant to dust, maybe rearrange things. But now the box sat in the middle of her living room carpet, her hands trembling as she peeled the brittle tape back. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it. The pale blue bridesmaid's dress, folded once, a pair of letters, a newspaper clipping yellowed with time, newlyweds lost at sea during honeymoon, and at the very bottom, a small white seashell on a ribbon, the one Camille had worn in her hair when she boarded the boat. It had been 25 years, 25 birthdays with no phone call, no postcard, not even a body to bury. Lee had been 18 then, still naive, still believing that good people got good endings. Camille, 5 years older, had been her idol, graceful, warm, the kind of girl who lit up rooms just by walking in. And Grant? He'd been the type of man every girl either loved or warned you about. Charismatic, tall, funny, a little reckless. But Camille had trusted him. That was enough. Or at least, it had to be. Lee sat back on the carpet and wiped her face. Somewhere in the world, Camille had disappeared. On an island Lee had never stepped foot on. Until now. Because 2 days ago, a phone call came from someone she didn't know. An old man on an island she'd barely heard of. He said, "They found a camera in the sand. You may want to see what's on it." And just like that, 25 years of silence cracked open. Lee had read the postcard 100 times. The front showed a watercolor painting of a small bay, turquoise waves lapping at white sand, a palm tree slanting over a cabana. In fading handwriting across the back, Camille had written, "Lee Bug. This place is pure magic, like something from a dream. Grant's already tanned and sunburned. I swear he's part lizard. I'll bring you back a seashell. Or maybe never come back at all, LOL. Love you like crazy. See." It should have made her smile, but it didn't. Because Camille never said, "like crazy." That had always been Lee's phrase. And LOL? Camille hated using slang like that, said it made everything sound fake. The card was postmarked August 4th, 1984, the day before they vanished. Lee traced the handwriting with her finger over and over. Something about it always felt wrong. Like someone trying too hard to sound like Camille. It wasn't paranoia. Lee had lived with that suspicion for years, carried it like a stone in her chest. Now, with the photo of Camille resurfaced, the white dress, the broken pier, the figure behind them, she couldn't ignore that feeling anymore. She slid the postcard back into its plastic sleeve gently. Then she packed her bag. She was going to Isleta del Mar. The flight to Isleta del Mar was short, but heavy. Lee sat by the window, eyes locked on the ocean below, her hands clutched tight around a padded envelope. Inside it, the printed photos the old man had overnighted. Photos pulled from a rusted camera buried in seaweed for 25 years. She didn't open the envelope until the wheels touched down. The air outside was thick with salt and heat. The island hadn't changed much since the 80s. Small streets, pastel buildings, the same sleepy hush over everything. But the moment Lee stepped outside the airport gates, something in her shifted. Time didn't feel linear here. At her hotel, she peeled the envelope open. Inside, 12 photographs, slightly faded but intact. Her heart knocked against her ribs as she slid the first one out. Camille, smiling at the camera, standing barefoot on a dock, wind whipping through her dark hair. The same gentle curve to her lips, the same sharp chin Lee used to tease her about. In the photo, Camille was holding something in her hand, small, white, glinting. Lee brought the image closer to her face. A shell. Not just any shell. The shell. She remembered giving it to Camille the night before the wedding. They'd sat on Lee's bed, giggling like teenagers, and she'd tied a silk ribbon around the seashell and said, "For luck," or magic, or both. Camille had laughed and tucked it into her suitcase. Lee blinked fast. There it was, right there in the photo, in Camille's hand. 25 years later. She flipped through the other prints. Grant sitting behind Camille on a stone wall, his face sun-drenched. Camille on a swing. Camille on the beach. Camille leaning into Grant, whispering something that made him laugh. Then, the final photo. They were both there, but in the distance, standing behind a tree. A shadow. A man, maybe. Tall. Half out of frame. Watching. The hair on Lee's arm stood up. It wasn't just a camera that washed ashore. It was evidence. A breadcrumb. A piece of her sister's last day, somehow kept alive by the ocean, and something, or someone, had been with them that wasn't supposed to be. The official story had never satisfied her. Back in 1984, the police had called it a tragic maritime accident. The Newlyweds had supposedly rented a small skiff for a sunset ride, likely got caught in a current and were lost to the tide. No bodies, no wreckage, no belongings, nothing ever found. Lee remembered sitting in her parents' living room when the news broke, her mother gasping like the breath had been ripped from her chest. Her father turned to stone. And Lee? She just stared at the floor, waiting for someone to say they'd made a mistake, that it wasn't her sister, but no one ever did. And then, things got quiet. Too quiet. Authorities stopped asking questions, reporters moved on. Camille and Grant became just another story. A freak accident in paradise. Lee never bought it. She'd studied the sea charts back then. She knew the tide patterns around Isleta del Mar. If the boat had capsized, something, anything, should have washed up. The wind had been calm, no storm, no rough water. And now, this camera appeared. With no corrosion on the film. With images still whole. Somewhere, that boat hadn't sunk. It had been hidden. Lee looked again at the final photo. That shadowed figure in the distance. He was real. And he was watching. She whispered aloud in the hotel room, to no one. They didn't drown. Because in her gut, she knew. Something darker had happened on that island, and now it was rising to the surface. The boat ride to Isleta del Mar took just under an hour, but for Lee, it felt like a crossing into another century. The island appeared slowly, like a mirage on the horizon. Palm fronds swaying over faded bungalows, tin rooftops catching the sun, time peeling the paint off every building. It looked exactly like the photographs. The ferry dock was smaller than she expected, rebuilt since the old one washed away in the 90s, according to the ferry captain. He pointed out the spot where the original pier used to stand. "Storms took it," he said. But something in his voice sounded rehearsed. She stepped onto the dock and felt a strange resistance in her chest, not nerves, not fear. More like pressure, like the air itself remembered things. Lee made her way through the narrow main street, past a market stand with dusty pineapples, a row of fishing boats bobbing in rhythm. Locals watched her as she passed, not rudely, not quite, just curious. Older women murmured behind their fans. A man in a sun hat nodded once, then turned away. A small child pointed at her, whispering something to his mother. It was like walking through the last photograph. She found the guest house Camille had written about, La Rosa del Mar, faded pink walls, an open-air lobby, and a sleepy receptionist who looked no older than 20. Lee asked for a room and gave her name. The receptionist's fingers paused over the register. "Morgan?" she said softly. "Like, Camille Morgan?" Lee nodded. The girl blinked. "My abuela. She used to talk about her." Lee leaned in. "What did she say?" The receptionist glanced around, then whispered that they were beautiful. The couple. They came here once, then disappeared. People say the island took them. Before Lee could respond, the girl smiled, too quickly, and handed her a key. Room 6, end of the hall. Lee turned slowly, taking in the lobby again. Framed photos on the walls, some modern, some decades old. In one, behind the desk, she swore she saw Camille and Grant walking along the beach in the far background, frozen in time. Like the rest of this place. The bar sat just off the beach. A low, crooked structure built from driftwood and corrugated tin. The sign out front had no name, just the outline of a parrot long faded by salt and sun. Lee stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. A few locals leaned over pool tables. Ceiling fans stirred the heavy air but did nothing to cool it. Behind the counter stood a man with gray hair, a twisted towel slung over one shoulder, and eyes that had seen too much. She slid onto a stool. "Cerveza?" he asked. "Water," she replied. He nodded once and turned. She took a breath. "I'm looking for someone, or people," she said. "They came here in 1984. Newlyweds. Camille and Grant Morgan." The bartender stilled. The bottle paused mid-air. He set it down slowly, then leaned both hands on the bar. "You shouldn't go around saying that year," he said, not unkindly. "Some folks don't like to hear it." Lee frowned. "Why?" He stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. "That year brought bad luck, the kind that doesn't wash off." He motioned with 2 fingers toward the beach. "Camille and Grant. Yes, I remember them. Sweet girl. He was loud, like jokes, music. They stayed at La Rosa, drank here once. Then," he shrugged. "What happened?" she pressed. "They weren't the only ones," he muttered. "A fisherman went missing that summer. So did a German backpacker, all within 3 months. People said it was the tide. I don't think it was the tide." "Then what?" He glanced around the room. The pool game had gone silent. Eyes were on them. "I don't know," he said softly, voice dropping. "And I don't ask. This island, it remembers, and it don't like being stirred." He walked away without another word. Lee sat there a moment, listening to the clink of ice in glasses, the creak of fans overhead. People had disappeared before. Camille and Grant weren't the only ones. Something had swallowed them, and it hadn't been the ocean. The office at La Rosa del Mar smelled of mildew and mothballs. A small, sun-bleached room tucked behind the reception desk, stacked high with boxes, frayed binders, and ledgers so old their spines were dissolving. Lee stood in the doorway until the receptionist, Sophia, finally nodded and waved her in. "My abuela used to manage this place," she said. "She saved everything, said the past always has a way of returning." Lee stepped carefully past a broken fan and began scanning the spines. Each binder was labeled with dates, handwritten in faded ink. June 1984, July 1984, August 1984. There it was. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, binder in her lap. The pages inside were crisp but yellowing, with columns for name, room number, date in, date out, and payment. The names scrolled down: German tourists, newlyweds, backpackers. And then her heart skipped. Camille Morgan, room 6, August 1st. Grant Morgan, room 6, August 1st. But something was wrong. Their names were scratched out. Not just crossed off, obliterated. Thick black lines had been dragged over each name, again and again, as if someone had tried to erase them entirely from history. Lee traced the gouges in the paper. The ink had bled through 3 layers. She flipped the page. The next entries jumped from July 30th to August 5th. "No checkout," she whispered. "No date out, no payment record. Just gone. Sophia stepped behind her. She'd been watching from the door. That page used to be clean, she said. I saw it when I was little. They were there, clear as day. Who blacked it out? Sophia shook her head. My abuela said someone came after, from the mainland, wore a suit, asked questions, took papers. Lee swallowed hard. A government official? Police? Someone trying to hide something? This wasn't an accident, she said. Someone wanted them erased. She stared at the ruined names, her pulse racing. It wasn't just the ocean that had tried to forget them. People had too. The night air wrapped the island in a blanket of warmth and silence, broken only by the click of Lee's sandals against the resort's cracked stone path. Sophia had mentioned someone. If anyone remembers anything from back then, it's Esteban. He was the night guard for 30 years. She found him on the northern edge of the property, sitting on a bench just beyond the old laundry room, a wide straw hat hiding most of his face. A transistor radio crackled softly beside him, an old bolero tune whispering from its speaker. Señor Esteban? He turned his head slowly. His eyes were pale and unblinking. I'm Lee, she said, Camille's sister. Silence. Then a slow nod. I remember. He gestured for her to sit. The girl, the one with the seashell in her hair, and the boy. Loud laugh. Very much in love, he said. Lee swallowed. Do you remember what happened? Esteban didn't answer right away. He stared out at the trees. It was late, he began. Very late, maybe after midnight. I was making my rounds by the west path. I saw them down near the shoreline. They were not fighting, but tense, arguing. She looked upset. He was pacing, hands on his hips. A lump formed in Lee's throat. What were they arguing about? I don't know, Esteban said, but it wasn't like the day before. They were quiet that morning, calm. That night was different. He paused. Then I saw someone else. Lee's skin tingled. Where? He pointed up toward the cliffs. By the tree line, watching, not moving, just standing still, no flashlight, no smoke, just standing, like a statue. Could you see his face? She asked. No, Esteban said. Only the shape, a man, tall, not from the resort. I'd never seen him before. What did you do? I went to report it. By the time I came back, they were gone. Lee leaned forward, voice barely a whisper. Gone? He nodded. No sign of them, not a footstep, not a whisper. The radio crackled between them. I told the police. They told me to forget it. Esteban finally turned to face her, but I never did. And Lee knew. Neither would she. The next morning, the tide was lower than Lee had seen since arriving. The wind had calmed, and the ocean sat still, its waves barely whispering over the sand. She wandered down toward what remained of the original dock, now just a crooked stretch of wood and a handful of barnacled pillars jutting out like ribs from the shoreline. Locals said most of it was swept away during a hurricane in '92, but small fragments remained. Broken stone steps, nails rusted into driftwood, a few forgotten bolts still embedded in the sand. Children played along the beach, kicking through piles of seaweed and shells. Lee watched them absently until one of them paused. A girl, maybe 8, crouched low to the ground and started digging. She held something in her hand, tiny and gold. It caught the sunlight like a star. The girl's mother called her name, but she stood and ran to Lee instead, holding the object out. Es tuyo? Lee knelt down and took it gently. Her breath caught. It was an earring. Small, delicate, shaped like a tiny gold teardrop, worn but still intact. Her eyes welled. She remembered Camille wearing it that morning, the day she left for the ferry. They were getting ready in the mirror, side by side. Camille had leaned forward, fussing with her hair, and said, "Do you think these are too much for the beach?" Lee had laughed. "You could wear a crown and still look barefoot." She clutched the earring now, her hand trembling. "Where did you find this?" she asked the girl, her voice thin. The child pointed back toward the broken stones near the dock's end. "It was in the sand," she said in Spanish. "It was waiting." Lee whispered, "No, it was buried." And now it had surfaced, like the truth, clawing its way back to shore. The memory came back all at once, sharp as broken glass, and just as painful. The day of the wedding had started warm and golden, with sunlight slanting through the kitchen windows of their childhood home. Camille was in the upstairs bedroom, veil draped over a chair, pinning her hair in place with slow, careful hands. Lee had been sitting cross-legged on the bed, clutching the little box with the seashell ribbon inside, waiting for the right moment to give it. Downstairs, their father's voice shattered the calm. It started quiet, then louder, then impossible to ignore. Lee had crept halfway down the stairs before she saw them, her father and Grant, face to face in the foyer. Her mother stood to the side, pale, gripping her coffee cup with both hands. "I said, 'You're not ready to be a husband,'" their father snapped, "and certainly not hers." Grant was trying, hands up, jaw tight, but he couldn't keep the heat out of his voice. "With respect, sir, it's not your decision. She deserves better than a runaway with a borrowed car and a tan." Camille appeared at the top of the stairs, halfway into her gown, breath caught in her chest. "Dad, stop," she said softly. He looked up at her, nostrils flared. "You're making a mistake." "I love him." "That's not what I asked." Lee remembered Camille walking down the stairs in silence, each step feeling like a protest. She stopped beside Grant, took his hand and said, "We're getting married. Today." Lee remembered the way their father's shoulders stiffened, how he didn't speak another word until they were halfway through the ceremony. He didn't walk her down the aisle. He didn't raise a glass. His face in the family photo looked like a statue's. After the honeymoon, after the disappearance, he'd said only one thing: "I told you he wasn't the kind to stay." And then he stopped talking about Camille altogether. For years Lee didn't push back. She couldn't. She didn't have answers of her own. Only grief, folded away like a photo in a drawer. Now, holding Camille's earring in her pocket, she realized something. Her father had never looked for the truth. He'd just looked for someone to blame. And Grant, with his loud laugh and his wild heart, had always been the easiest target. The municipal archive was tucked behind the post office. A low, crumbling building with sea-stained shutters and the smell of old paper pressed deep into its walls. Sophia had made a call for her. An old friend of her grandmother's, Senora Alvarez, agreed to let Lee browse the old police logs and local newspapers. "We don't digitize much here," she warned with a smile. "We still believe in ink and dust." Inside, it was barely lit. A single ceiling fan stirred the humid air as Lee sat at a wooden table stacked high with bound volumes of La Voz del Mar, the island's tiny weekly paper. She started in June 1984. One name after another, small stories, a bakery fire, a local festival, a theft at the fish market. Then, buried halfway through July, a headline caught her breath. "Tourist vanishes during morning swim, a 27-year-old backpacker from Frankfurt, last seen entering the water alone. Body never found." In the next issue, fisherman fails to return. After night crossing, boat discovered adrift. No signs of struggle. Then again, young couple reported missing after sunset hike. American honeymooners, names redacted, likely disoriented. No foul play suspected. It wasn't just Camille and Grant. There were 5 disappearances over just 3 months, all different ages, all different circumstances, none solved. Lee flipped faster now, her pulse tightening. Each article ended with the same two lines, printed like a reflex. No evidence of crime was found. Authorities urge caution near the coastline. She looked up at Senora Alvarez. "Why didn't anyone investigate further?" Lee asked. The woman hesitated, her eyes soft. "Because people started to say the island was touched, cursed, or watched." Lee swallowed. "Watched by what?" Senora Alvarez shook her head. "That depends on who you ask." Lee looked down again at the faded articles, her fingers trembling. This wasn't a single tragedy. It was a pattern, and Camille had walked straight into the middle of it. The journal had been buried in Lee's suitcase since she arrived, untouched. She hadn't had the courage to open it yet. It was Camille's, bound in soft leather with gold-edged pages, faded now with time. Lee had found it years ago, at the back of their mother's attic, nearly threw it away, assuming it was blank. But tucked between notes and sketches and packing lists were scraps of her sister's voice, and maybe something else. She sat by the window of her hotel room now, the waves beyond the glass barely audible, flipping through the journal slowly. Page after page, Camille had written like she was dreaming. "Grant says the water feels like silk. I believe him. The food is terrible, but we're too in love to care." But then, the handwriting changed. It got tighter, less playful. Words scratched in with shorter sentences. "Something feels wrong here. Grant doesn't sleep anymore. Last night I heard something outside, not waves, not wind." Lee stopped, heart hammering. She reached the back of the journal and found something wedged deep in the spine. A folded piece of cardstock, a postcard. She pulled it out slowly. On the front, a painted image of a cliffside over deep blue sea. On the back, Camille's handwriting. But this time, it was completely different. No playful banter, no Lee bug, no seashells, no jokes. Instead, "I think someone is watching us. Every time we leave the room, I feel eyes on my back. I tried to talk to Grant, but he brushes it off. I'm starting to think he knows more than he's telling me. If something happens to us, if we don't come back, I'm so sorry." There was no stamp, no address. She had never sent it. Lee stared at the card, her breath shallow. This wasn't the voice of a woman on her honeymoon. This was a warning. Something had frightened Camille enough to write a goodbye she never mailed. Lee folded the postcard and held it against her chest. Her sister hadn't disappeared by accident. She had felt it coming. The marina office was nothing more than a wooden shack pressed against the dock, its window propped open by a chipped coffee mug and a wind chime that hadn't rung in years. Inside, the air smelled like fuel and mildew. A single filing cabinet sat rusted in the corner, drawers labeled in smudged marker. Rentals 1980 to 1985, accidents, storm logs. Lee opened the first drawer and pulled the folder marked August 1984. The paper was brittle, the carbon copy handwriting barely legible in places, but there it was. August 3rd, Camille Morgan, Grant Morgan, boat number 7, 11:20 a.m. She stared at it. Her stomach began to tighten, because back at the archive, in the official police report she'd read just yesterday, it had clearly stated, "Couple departed on rented vessel number 12. Different boat, different number. And according to this form, boat number 12 hadn't been rented at all that week." Lee blinked, her thoughts scrambling. A mistake? Unlikely. These logs were written daily, time-stamped and initialed. The handwriting was clear. She flipped to the next page. Boat number 7 had been returned the same day, signed in by a dockhand named Louise C. But no follow-up, no report of a missing couple, no mention of a disappearance, just returned, logged, routine. So either someone brought the boat back and never said a word, or this entire record was fabricated. She leaned over the counter, knocking lightly until a weathered man stepped out from the back room, wiping his hands on a rag. "Excuse me, did you work here in 1984? He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Do you remember Boat 7? She asked, holding up the page. "Who returned it?" His jaw stiffened. "I don't," he said. "But if you're asking questions about that summer, be careful." And just like that, he turned and walked away. Lee stood frozen, the paper crinkling in her hands. Whatever had happened on that dock wasn't an accident, and the paper trail was starting to crack. Lee sat on a cracked stone bench outside a seaside cafe, sifting through old Polaroids a local vendor had collected from decades past. Flea market finds, donations, forgotten family albums. Most were faded snapshots of sunburnt tourists, birthday cakes, fishing boats. But one photo made her fingers stop. A group shot, 4 men around a fire pit, smiling beneath a line of string lights, and on the far right, a tall, thin man wearing a loose white shirt, with a jagged scar cutting across the left side of his jaw and neck. The scar looked like melted wax. Lee stared at it, pulse quickening. A shadow passed overhead. She looked up. The vendor, a woman in her 60s, had returned with a glass of papaya juice. She followed Lee's gaze to the photo. "Oh," she said, "that's El Gringo Quemado, the burned one." Lee blinked. "Who?" The woman chuckled softly, uneasily. "A strange man. Stayed for a few weeks that summer. Always by himself. Never took off his long sleeves, not even at the beach. The kids said he smelled like rust and medicine." "When was this?" "Same year your sister came," she said. 84. Lee's throat tightened. "Did he stay at La Rosa del Mar?" "No," the vendor said. "He kept to the jungle side of the island. Rented a shack from a fisherman's widow. Then after that storm in August, poof, gone." "Gone?" Lee asked. "Left everything. Food on the table. Bed untouched. Like someone walked into the trees and never came back." Lee looked again at the photo. The man's scarred face was caught mid-turn, but it wasn't just the wound that unsettled her. It was the expression. He wasn't smiling. He was watching someone off camera. She flipped the photo over. No name. Just a faint date scribbled in pencil. August 2984. One day before Camille vanished. One more ghost in the growing gallery. The lighthouse stood crooked against the sky like an old soldier forgotten by time. Its white paint had long peeled into gray patches, and the iron door at its base groaned on its hinges as Lee forced it open. Inside, dust choked the air. Wooden steps spiraled upward into darkness. Each creak beneath her feet sounded like the island exhaling old secrets. Sophia had mentioned it in passing. The lighthouse has been closed since the late 80s. Keeper moved to the mainland after something spooked him. Said he saw things. Lee hadn't planned to come, but the pattern of vanishing stories kept leading her back to edges, to places people avoided, places that held silence like a grudge. She reached the keeper's quarters near the top, a tiny square room with a broken chair, rusted lamp, and a battered desk covered in bird droppings and sand. Beneath the clutter was a leather-bound book, warped by time, spine cracked open like a wound. A journal. She turned the pages slowly, past entries about fog patterns, ship schedules, fish counts. Then, August 3rd, 1984. Something wrong tonight. I heard them. A man and a woman, screaming. It echoed up from the rocks. Not angry screams. Terrified. Then silence. I lit the beacon even though I wasn't scheduled. Stayed up until dawn. Lee's hand trembled. She turned the page. August 4th, 1984. The police came today. I told them what I heard. They told me I must have dreamed it. I didn't. I know what I heard. I saw movement down by the old pier after midnight. Someone else was out there, not one of them. A shaky line followed, ink smeared. I should have gone down there. I was afraid. Lee closed her eyes. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't ghost stories. Someone had heard them. Someone had tried to speak, but no one had listened. She pressed her hand flat against the journal. Camille hadn't disappeared in silence. She'd screamed for help, and the island swallowed her anyway. The envelope arrived without a return address, no note. Just slipped under Lee's hotel door in the early morning hours, silent as mist. She stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside, photographs, glossy, color, sharp, too sharp. She laid them out across the bedspread. Camille and Grant, walking down the stone path near the market, holding hands. Another, Camille reading on a balcony, unaware, hair tied up, face soft in the sunlight. Then another, Grant swimming, laughing, caught mid-splash, taken from the tree line. And then Camille alone, sitting by the old dock at dusk, barefoot, back turned, her face partially reflected in the water. In that one, the angle was high. Too high. Someone had been watching them, and not just once. Over several days. From a distance, with deliberate care. The photos weren't casual. They weren't candid. They were calculated. Her hands shook as she picked up the last image. It was Camille, clearly frightened, caught mid-step as if startled by a noise behind her. One shoulder twisted back, her eyes wide, mouth open slightly. Not posing, reacting. To someone. Lee's stomach turned. This wasn't curiosity. It was surveillance. Obsession. Whoever had taken these had followed them, studied them, memorized them, and then kept the evidence hidden. For 25 years. She turned the envelope inside out, searching for a clue. Nothing. Just the faint smell of mildew. Maybe the sea. She scanned the room. The door was still locked. No sounds in the hallway. Outside, the wind picked up. A storm was building again. She clutched the photos and whispered to herself, they were hunted. And now, the hunter knew she was here. The tide was creeping in again, whispering against the shore like a secret too old to keep. Lee found him near the dock, hunched on an overturned crate, mending a net with trembling fingers. He looked older than the island itself, face carved deep by salt and sun, hair wiry white, eyes always scanning the horizon like something might return if he blinked too long. They called him Mateo Viejo, the old one. Sophia had whispered it to her. He saw something, I think, but he doesn't talk. Not anymore. Not unless you press. She approached slowly. Señor Mateo, she said in soft Spanish. His eyes flicked up, sharp, even now. I'm looking for answers, Lee said. My sister, Camille Morgan. She disappeared here, in 1984. Silence. She knelt in front of him, pulled something from her bag. The photo. Camille at the dock, the earring still in her ear, smiling in the sun. She handed it to him. Mateo stared for a long time. Then his voice came, dry, low, as if pulled from deep inside his chest. She was scared. Lee's heart jumped. You saw her? He nodded slowly. I was fishing early, just before dawn. I saw them walk down to the dock, but they weren't alone. Lee leaned in, her fingers digging into her knees. A man was waiting, not one of ours, tall, pale, burn on the side of his face. The words hit like a hammer. The one with the scar, she whispered. Mateo looked away, jaw tight. He loaded the boat, took the engine key himself, told them he was the guide. The girl looked uneasy. But the boy? He laughed. Trusted him. Lee felt her stomach twist. You didn't stop them? I tried. I asked where they were going. The man said, private charter. No worries, old man. Mateo spat. But I knew. Something was off. He dropped the net in his lap, eyes suddenly wet. They never came back. Lee whispered. Why didn't you tell anyone? I did. His voice broke. No one listened. Police said I imagined it, said I drank too much, said there was no charter, no guest, no man with a scar. His hands trembled. They made me forget. But now he remembered, and so did Lee. It took half a day of coaxing and the promise of silence, but Sophia finally agreed to take Lee to the place her grandmother once called El Silencio Bajo, the quiet below. They left at dawn, hiking through a crooked path beyond the abandoned sugar mill, vines brushing their legs, the air thick with the hum of insects and old heat. No signs pointed the way. No maps marked the trail. Only those who remembered knew it existed. The cove revealed itself suddenly. A bowl carved into the island's edge, shielded by jagged black rock and thick palms. The tide was out, exposing a pale crescent of sand littered with driftwood, rusted cans, and something else. Sophia stopped short. There, she whispered. Lee stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. Buried under layers of seaweed and sand was the outline of a hull, splintered, bowed inward like a rib cage. Faded blue paint still clung to the wood, peeling like old skin. She dropped to her knees and brushed away the layers. Beneath it, numbers, barely legible. Boat number 7. Her pulse surged. This was the boat, their boat, but it had never drifted out to sea. It had been dragged here, hidden deliberately. She circled around, scanning the wreckage, a broken oar, a scrap of canvas, and then, half buried in the sand near the rocks, a rusted wristwatch, still clasped. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was Grant's. She remembered it from photos, from their front porch the day he asked Camille's hand. Silver band, cracked face, stopped at 342. Lee stood, the wreckage yawning behind her like a wound the island tried to keep shut. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it all vanish. But the truth, like the tide, was coming back. The sun had crept higher now, sharpening every sound, the creak of palm fronds, the buzz of flies, the breath caught in Lee's throat. She was still kneeling beside the wreckage, sifting through the damp sand with fingers gone numb. Everything here felt wrong. Heavy. Like the ground didn't want to give anything up. And then she touched metal. Cold, smooth, buried just beneath a flat stone beside the warped hull. Her heart stuttered. She pulled the rock aside, hands shaking, and dug gently with her fingers until the wet grain slipped away to reveal it. A thin gold band, still intact, still shining beneath the grime. Her breath left her in a sob. It was Camille's wedding ring. She knew it instantly, not just from photos or memory, but something deeper. It had a tiny nick on the inside edge from when Camille dropped it down the sink the night before the wedding. Lee had helped her fish it out with a wire hanger, laughing in their pajamas, their hair still damp from the salon. Now it was here, hidden, intentionally. She pressed it to her lips, then her forehead, and let the tears come. This wasn't a random loss. Camille hadn't drowned. She hadn't slipped. She hadn't run away. She had been taken, dragged from the boat, buried from the world, and someone, had silenced every witness. This ring wasn't dropped in panic. It had been left, like a message. I didn't leave, Lee whispered aloud. I was here. The trees around her stood silent, watching. Behind her, Sophia kept her distance, letting Lee crumble without interruption. The island had been trying to forget, but the ring remembered. The boat remembered. The tide remembered. And now, so did she. Lee stood, clutching the ring so tightly it cut into her skin. Whoever had done this was still out there, still hiding. but the past was clawing its way out of the dark. The storm hit just after midnight. Thunder cracked low across the sea like cannon fire, and rain tore across the island in sheets. But Lee didn't sleep. Not after what she'd found in the cove. Not after what Sophia had whispered on the way back. There were rumors, she'd said quietly, eyes flicking to the road. Back in the 80s, people disappearing, boats landing in places they shouldn't, and not just tourists. Now, Lee sat in Sophia's living room, soaked to the skin, watching the flames in the hearth fight the wind howling down the chimney. Sophia's grandfather, Tio Raphael, stirred a mug of coffee with trembling hands. He'd worked at the docks for 30 years before his eyesight gave out. "You really want to know what happened to your sister?" he said, voice low. Lee nodded. He leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. The island was a stop, a quiet one, for things that didn't want to be seen. "Drugs?" Lee asked. He shook his head. "Worse sometimes. Guns, people, stolen goods, Americans, South Americans, even people from the military, all in on it. Boats came late, no papers, no lights. The fishermen knew to stay away." Lee's stomach turned. And Camille and Grant? They weren't meant to see it, Raphael said. But if they went out early, if they saw the wrong boat, the wrong people, he let the thought hang in the smoke. "They became a problem," Lee finished for him. Raphael nodded. "Sometimes problems disappear," he said simply, "and people like me are told not to remember." Sophia crossed herself quietly. Lee stood up. "So the scarred man, the one who took them out, he wasn't just some stranger." "No," Raphael said. "He was someone's shadow, someone sent to clean things up." Lee felt the weight of the ring in her pocket. Her sister hadn't been caught in some accident. She'd crossed paths with something organized, something hidden, something that still didn't want to be found. And now Lee had kicked over the nest, the ring, the photos, the truth. Whatever they'd witnessed out there on that boat, it had cost them everything, and Lee was next in line to pay. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a sky bruised with gray and streets littered with palm fronds and shattered coconuts. The town moved slowly, as if exhaling after holding its breath too long. Lee sat cross-legged on the hotel room floor, the recovered vintage camera in her lap. It was rusted, heavy, still salt-stained from the ocean. The one the boy had found tangled in seaweed after the storm. She'd spent the last week tracing her sister's ghost, but now, in this room, the ghost was about to speak. Inside the camera was a tiny reel-to-reel audio strip, half-melted but still intact. A local archivist in the next village had carefully salvaged it, warning her that the sound might be warped. But it didn't matter. She needed to hear her. The old tape recorder whirred to life, its wheels clicking slowly. A hiss, then crackle, then waves. Gentle at first, rolling in and out like breath. And voices. Camille, laughing, faint but unmistakable, light and unguarded. Then Grant, teasing her, something about seashells in her hair. A pause. Then the tone changed. Camille's voice again, tighter now. "Are you sure this is where he said to go?" Grant, a little distracted. "Yeah, it's fine. It's just around that bend, I think." More silence. Then another voice, distant. A third voice, male. Unclear. Closer than it should be. Camille whispered, barely audible. "I don't like this." Static bled through. Then a scream. Camille's scream. Sharp, abrupt. Then more shouting. Grant yelling something, cut off mid-word. The sound of a struggle. Footsteps on wood. A splash. Then nothing. Silence. Lee stared at the recorder, her hands frozen on her knees. The reel kept spinning, but the room had gone utterly still. That scream wasn't panic. It was final. It was the sound of someone realizing they weren't going home. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears hot behind her eyes. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft click of the tape finishing. She rewound it, just enough to hear her sister's laugh again. Just that, nothing else. Then she let it stop. This wasn't closure, not yet, but it was something. Proof. Camille had tried to leave a message. She'd used the only thing she had left. Her voice. And now, after 25 years, Lee had heard her. The island was darker than usual that night. No breeze, no music from the town square, just the hush of something waiting. Grant's heart was pounding. He kept his arm around Camille, walking fast but trying not to look like he was running. They hadn't spoken since leaving the cliffs. They didn't need to. They'd both seen it. A man loading crates into a boat that didn't belong to any resort. Flashlights, voices in another language. A girl, blindfolded, being dragged below deck. The scarred man standing nearby, silent, watching, as if daring them to react. Camille had tugged Grant's arm, and they'd slipped back into the trees. Now they were cutting through the side path to the rental cabins, nearly at the bungalow. "We need to go," Grant whispered, unlocking the door. Camille didn't argue. She was pale, barefoot, hands shaking as she grabbed her bag and shoved in her journal, her book, her camera. Grant stepped outside again, scanned the road. Empty. But his gut twisted. He knew someone had seen them. Back inside, he rummaged for the boat keys. "We'll go now, before sunrise. Head around the bend, call for help from the other side." Camille hesitated. "What if they follow us? They won't know we've left until—" Crash. A rock hit the window, shattering it inward. Grant grabbed Camille and backed her into the closet. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, pressing the key into her palm. "If something happens, take the boat. Don't look back." Her eyes were full of tears. He kissed her forehead. "I'll meet you by the rocks." He slipped out the back door. Rain had started, soft at first. Footsteps echoed near the front porch. Grant circled wide, staying low. He saw a figure step into the bungalow. Scarred, tall, not alone. Grant didn't run, not yet. He drew them away. Into the woods, back toward the sound of the sea. He didn't think of himself. He only thought of her. The hospice was tucked behind a crumbling mission chapel overlooking a field of scorched grass and leaning crosses. The man Lee had come to see hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. But when she walked into the dim room carrying the old photo of the boat, his eyes flickered open. His name was Angel Romero, a former dockhand. He hadn't been on the registry, but Sophia had remembered him, said he left the island right after the disappearances. "Camille Morgan," Lee said softly, sitting beside him. "Anne Grant. August 1984. You were there." His eyes welled, dry and glassy. He tried to speak, failed. She pulled the photo from her pocket, the one of the boat in the cove. The numbers faded but still visible. Boat number 7. He reached for it with a trembling hand, held it like it burned. "I didn't know," he whispered hoarsely. "Not until it was too late." Lee leaned closer. "You saw him." He nodded slowly. "The boy, Grant. He was bleeding, shoulder. Dragged himself up the rocks behind the lagoon. I was hiding in the trees. I thought he wouldn't make it." Her throat tightened. "What did he say?" Angel's eyes grew distant, like he was looking through time. "He kept saying her name. Camille, Camille." Then he grabbed my arm, pulled me in close, said, "Tell her I loved her. Tell her I didn't run. I tried to come back." Lee's chest ached. "I promised I would," Angel rasped. "But I didn't. I was scared. They were still on the island, watching everything. People disappeared for less." He turned his head slowly, facing the window where the sun had started bleeding orange across the floor. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have told someone." Lee reached for his hand, held it tightly. "You just did." His fingers curled weakly around hers. She didn't cry. Not this time. Because in that moment, she knew something Camille never got to. Grant hadn't abandoned her. He had fought. And his last words were for her. Words that took 25 years to reach their home. The tide was going out. Lee stood alone on the beach, barefoot, her hair tangled by salt wind, the island quiet behind her like it was holding its breath. The waves murmured, pulling gently at the shore as if reluctant to let go. She had come here alone, no camera, no notepad, no Sophia, no questions, just a pocketful of ghosts and a heart heavier than it had ever been. She knelt near the cove, the same one where the wreckage had surfaced after the storm, where the bones of the truth had begun to rise, and sifted through the damp sand. Her fingers brushed against something smooth, curved. She pulled it out slowly, a seashell, cracked along one edge. But still, the same dusky pink Camille had always loved. The same kind she'd once looped into a ribbon and tied to Lee's wrist the morning of the wedding, whispering, "So you'll remember I'm yours, even when I'm not here." Lee stared at it now, throat tight, tears stinging. She remembered laughing that morning, brushing Camille's hair while humming off-key. The way her sister had always left a trail of tiny things behind, scribbled notes, bobby pins, laughter in rooms long after she'd gone. This shell was one of them. Maybe it wasn't the same one, or maybe it was. Maybe the island had been holding it all this time, like a kept promise. She turned toward the sea and whispered, "I remember you." Then she closed her hand around the shell and stepped into the surf. Not to leave, not to follow, but to return something. She opened her fingers and let the shell go, watching it tumble into the waves. The island didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt quiet, like it had finally said everything it needed to say. In the end, it wasn't the police. It wasn't forensics. It wasn't even time that gave Camille and Grant back. It was the storm, a force of nature that cracked open what human silence had buried. The same wind that ripped through the palms, the same waves that slammed against the cliffs, had pushed a rusted camera onto the beach, tangled in seaweed, where a boy searching for shells found it and unknowingly opened a door no one had dared to touch in 25 years. That camera didn't just contain photographs. It held their voices, their fear, their final moments. It was as if the island had grown tired of pretending it didn't remember. Lee walked through town now and felt the way eyes lingered, not out of suspicion but recognition. Not everyone spoke aloud, but something in their glances said, "Yes, we always knew. We just couldn't afford to know it out loud." At the marina, an old woman placed a single flower on the bench by the docks. At the church, someone lit a candle and whispered a name they'd claimed to forget. Even Sophia, usually so guarded, had left a folded paper crane in the lagoon, a symbol of apology, or maybe peace. The island, once silent, was slowly learning to acknowledge its ghosts. And so was Lee. She didn't come here to expose a crime. Not really. Not for a trial or a headline. She came for Camille, to find the girl who had vanished in the prime of her joy, and to return her to the world that pretended she was never here. Now, Lee carried her sister not as a question, but as a presence. The storm had done what no one else could. It had washed the truth ashore, and the tide, for once, hadn't taken it back. It wasn't announced, no flyers, no invitation. But when Lee stepped onto the beach just after sunset, carrying a small candle in one hand and Camille's wedding ring in the other, they were already there. Sophia, the vendor who remembered the scarred man, a boy holding his mother's hand, The same boy who'd found the rusted camera tangled in seaweed. Even Tio Raphael, leaning on his cane, stood silently at the edge of the dunes, his eyes wet. The sky was painted in dying oranges and bruised purples, the ocean calm for once, as if the island understood what this was. Lee walked to the shoreline barefoot. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she opened a small wooden box and held the ring inside up toward the horizon. The same gold band she had found buried under the boat, still cool in her palm, still curved with her sister's warmth. Camille had worn it for only 5 days, and then nothing. No farewell, no ritual, no resting place, just silence. Until now. "I don't know what this is supposed to be," Lee said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "But I know she deserved more than what she got." She paused, holding the ring over the water. She deserved a life, a future, a family. She deserved to grow old and tell this story herself. The waves lapped at her toes, like they were listening. "She was not a ghost," Lee whispered. "She was Camille Morgan, my sister, and she was real." She leaned forward, kissed the ring, and let it drop. It caught the last light of the sun as it slipped beneath the surface, vanishing into the tide. The crowd behind her remained quiet, not out of indifference, but reverence. A few began to light candles. Some set them in paper lanterns that floated gently across the water, glowing like stars returning to the ocean. Lee stood watching until the last flame disappeared into the dark. There were no speeches, no prayers, only waves and wind and memory, and a stillness that didn't feel empty, just full of everything unsaid. She turned from the sea and walked back toward the people who had once kept their silence, and now stood with her, remembering. Tonight, Camille finally got her goodbye, not as a victim, not as a question, but as a woman, deeply loved, who would not be forgotten. Back home, the world had moved on. The grocery store still smelled like lemons and cheap bleach. Her apartment plants were wilted but alive. The city pulsed with traffic and motion, like it never knew something had been missing. But Lee was different now. She unpacked slowly, not just bags, but memories. She placed the photo of Camille, the one on the dock, eyes squinting toward the sun. On the bookshelf, between 2 old novels. She placed the recovered seashell in a shallow bowl by the window, where the light could touch it every morning. There was no press conference, no arrest. The man with the scar, if he was still alive, had vanished back into whatever shadow he came from. There were whispers, government records buried too deep, names too powerful, no tidy ending. And yet, it didn't feel unfinished, because the silence was over. The truth, once hidden beneath tide and fear, now had a voice. Lee wrote Camille's name in ink again, not in a report, not in a file, but in a letter she mailed to their childhood church. A name for the memorial wall, a candle lit every August. She smiled through the ache. Closure hadn't come like a slam of the gavel or a solved case. It came in pieces, a ring, a scream on a tape, a scarred memory, a shell in the sand, and in knowing finally that Camille had not been forgotten. She had simply been waiting to be found. The sea was calm again. Children chased each other down the shoreline, their laughter rising into the golden evening air, mingling with the hush of the waves, as if the ocean had decided to give something back after all these years of taking. Lee stood just beyond the tide line, her sandals in one hand, watching the horizon stretch endlessly, glowing amber where the sun met the water. It looked like the same beach where Camille once walked, once laughed, once disappeared. But it wasn't, not anymore. It had changed. Or maybe Lee had. Maybe that's what truth does. Not wipe pain clean, but give it shape, give it meaning. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a photograph, one of the last from the recovered camera. Camille, wind in her hair, half turning, smiling like the world hadn't yet hurt her. Lee tucked it gently into the pages of her journal, closed the cover, and exhaled. There were still no answers for some of it, but there was peace now. Not because everything had been solved, but because someone had listened, because someone had come back. She turned slowly and walked away from the shore, her footprints fading behind her, already washed soft by the tide. But something remained beneath the surface, not just memory, but love, and the sound of waves that, for the first time in 25 years, no longer whispered loss, but homecoming.